before we took the break, I mentioned that Mr. Burnham in a public speech said that WPA should make their wills. And of course, 3 members of the WPA were murdered during that period, 1979-80.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that.
Well, young Ohini Kwama, who was an outstanding cooperator, he was a cooperative activist, and he was, in fact, the person who was running our party center at the time. And, you know, the police alleged that he had been ferrying arms or something in the middle of the street, and he was gunned down in broad daylight, so he was the first. And then Edward Dublin was killed in Linden, unprovoked. The police shot him. And there was a sense of terror. There was a general sense of terror. We were all under 24-hour surveillance. Our houses were being ransacked on a regular basis. Many of us were not sleeping in our own beds night after night. It was a very, very tense and difficult period.
And all of this because you were mobilizing people on the
We were mobilizing,
streets
and because, you see, Burnham was facing in the civil rebellion something he had not had to face before. And that is that the black people were on the streets against him. You see, when the PPP had organized their protests of Indian sugar workers and so, Burnham did not have to bother about this. He had this under control. But when that rebellion began, and it was multiracial, people of all classes, people of all ages, people coming to public meetings as though to a celebration, the impact of the cultural work we were doing on the streets at the time, there was just an immense amount of energy, and the dictator was very nervous.
And of course,
no
the person at the center of this rebellion who emerged as the leader, Dr. Walter Rodney.
Of course.
And you mentioned just now that black people came onto the streets, African Guyanese.
Absolutely.
And that's crucial. Talk a little bit about Walter Rodney's work and his influence on that section of the population in terms of bringing them into the anti-dictatorial movement.
Well, it had to do really with a lot of it, I think now, when I think about it, had really to do with the power of his own personality and a kind of integrity of personality itself. And some of his activities were really so outstanding and extraordinary, the demonstration, the exemplary nature of his life. I recall during the Arnold Rampersad trial, this was a trial where the police had arrested a PPP activist from the quarantine, accused him of murder. He had gone through one trial, I think he went through a second trial. They moved the trial to Georgetown. They were determined to hang this man. And they moved the trial to Georgetown because they said the state could not get a fair trial in the quarantine, where in Georgetown they would get a jury mostly of African Guyanese people. And Burnham intended to play the race game and manipulate these people. And Walter went to the street corners. And I remember that evening at Louisa Row, him talking about that he was speaking as a black man, and his sense of incredible shame as he saw black brothers and sisters coming into the court lying and attempting to hang his Indian brother. And there was something in the quality of that kind of commitment to people, regardless of race and class and all of that was very inspiring to people.
So he became a direct challenge to, at least that's how Burnham saw it.
Absolutely, and you see the defiance, Rodney's defiance, the fact that the dictator required people to be quiet, compliant, afraid, and the culture of silence that had built up around in Guyana was really quite extraordinary. Nobody was prepared to say anything, everybody was frightened, and here came this rather slight young man, someone who could be working anywhere in the world, came with immense distinction at the age of, in his late 30s, and began to stand up to Mr. Burnham, mocked him, got people laughing at him, in fact, went out of his way to break down this cordon of awe that Burnham had managed to erect around himself. And Rodney just punctured all of that and took the clothes, stripped the emperor naked. And that I think was the greatest inspiration to people. And the fact that he could not be silenced. When they prevented him from using a microphone, he rolled up a cardboard and spoke through it, a funnel. He could not be silenced. And I think that that example of absolute defiance in relation to military power, threats, and all of these things, and his uncompromising attitude towards the unity of the working people, the work he did for the sugar workers. I recall myself when I went back in 77, that the very first political activity I got involved in 77 when I returned was mobilizing strike relief for a big sugar strike that had taken place that year.
The
135-day strike, which was 77.
Yeah.
And I got very involved in that. And Walter was going around speaking at GAU meetings, encouraging the sugar workers and giving immense solidarity to them.
And something that people don't talk about is the role that Walter and the WPA played in terms of mobilizing African Guyanese against the propaganda that Indians wanted all the money. That's why they were striking.
In fact, the PPP handled that sugar strike rather badly, and we had to do a lot of work to counter the propaganda that Burnham was putting out. You know, the sugar workers want everything, this, that. And that was having its effect on the hard-pressed public sector workers who happened to be African Guyanese, on the police and so on. So he had positioned the Indians and the sugar workers in a certain way. And part of our work in that period was to demolish that and attempt to get the African working people to see that the struggle of the sugar workers was a just struggle, that it was not dissimilar from their struggle, and attempt to work at this kind of communality of interests among these groups.
So in a certain sense, Walter Rodney and the Working People's Alliance were able to break the back of the dictatorship.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's where it first cracked. I mean, there's no doubt that it first cracked in 79. And the dictatorship never really recovered itself.
And of course, Walter Rodney was murdered in June 1980.
In June 1980, he was struck down in a bomb blast, killed on June 13th. And interestingly, you know, he didn't die at a moment of high mobilization. It was a quieter movement in the rebellion, a quieter moment in the rebellion when he was struck down. And of course, the popular movement went into a kind of recoil and went into, and the reaction then mounted. And between June 79 and June 1980 and the end of that year, Burnham felt confident enough to hold elections in 1980.
And
he had gotten rid of
he became executive president before the election.
First
Let's talk a little bit about the Rodney's murder and what has happened since then, because up till now, I mean, it's almost 20 years, and we still have not had a proper investigation into the murder of Rodney. Talk a little bit about where that is at the moment, because a couple of years ago, Rodney's son went back to Guyana, staged a demonstration in front of the president's office. That's President Jagan. And the PPP had started to put some things in motion. Where that is at the moment?
Well, we have to back up a little bit. Nothing happened, of course, for many, many years. Every anniversary of June 13th, we would call for a commission of inquiry. Well, you know, we were, for as long as Burnham was there, this would get nowhere. But we continued every June 13th to be active, and it was not only WPA in Guyana, but Rodney's people around the world. And as you know, Walter was someone with tremendous impact in Africa, United States, Europe, and so on. And all over the place, groups would, in fact, around June be mobilizing. There were June 13 committees trying to bring pressure on Burnham and trying to flush out the executioner, because we knew where he had gone. We had tracked down Gregory Smith. He had gone to Cayenne. We knew he was living there.
Gregory Smith was the person who was
the penetration agent who, in fact, gave the bomb to Donald Rodney. And you know, the obscene thing about that was that the only action the police took following the assassination of Walter was to charge Donald for possession of explosives. And he was charged and convicted. And he appealed against that. And the appeal up to this day has not been heard in the appeal court. I'll come back to that. But so after Burnham died in 1985, and Mr. Hoyt, on acceding to the presidency in 86, did begin a rather cautious reform movement in his party and in the state. I don't think myself that Hoyt is given sufficient credit for attempting to lead a reform movement. I mean, it was a limited reform movement, but you know, he was dealing with a lot of criminals around him in the political party, and my own feeling was that there were real constraints and real limits. But he attempted to lead that kind of reform movement, and in 1987, 88, I think it was.
Yes, 88.
He held an inquest. And we had been calling for an inquest for a long time. He held this inquest. But like a lot of Hoyt's reforms of that period, he had tiptoed into reform. And what we had was a show inquest because the two main witnesses, namely Gregory Smith and Donald Rodney, were not available. We had offered to get Donald Rodney to come and give his evidence to the inquest, but the magistrate, who was well named, Mr. Pratt, didn't see fit to wait on them, so he went ahead and held this inquest, and the conclusion of the inquest was that Rodney had died by misadventure, thereby repeating the PNC fable about Rodney, you know, this extremely distinguished and high-powered historian being so stupid as to go and bomb a prison with a bomb that couldn't destroy a car. But that was the story they had put out, and that's the story that the inquest attempted to put an official stamp on. Well, we brushed that aside, continued with the work. Brother Guyana did a very, very ingenious thing. He went to the courts as a private citizen and laid a charge of murder against Smith and asked the courts for a warrant for his arrest. Under our laws, you can do it as a private citizen. It was a private action. Well, the chief magistrate at the time, Mr. Birch Smith, denied his application. But at the end, I'll tell you why that was significant. So we heard nothing more of that. Well, we went on. We had democratic elections in '92. The PPP came to power. Some of us, not all of us, but some of us had expected that with the PPP in power in '92, well, we would get somewhere towards getting a commission of inquiry and getting to the bottom of this murder. Nothing happened. For '92, '93, WPA said, well, you know, they've just come into power. I don't think we should try to pressure them too much. This is a delicate matter. The whole question of the transition from, you know, the PNC to the PPP was really a tender time. So we didn't really want to put too much pressure on them. So we didn't do much. So '92 came and went, '93 came and went, '94 came and went. And at each anniversary, we are now beginning to say, well, you know, what is happening? It's time we saw some movement on this. And it was only until Shaka Rodney came and, in fact, parked himself outside the Attorney General's office.
Shaka Rodney is
Walter's son. And he came, and it was over a Christmas holiday and into the New Year, and he fasted, carried out a fast outside of the Attorney General's office. And it was after that fast that I think the PPP was, moved to act. And they did act. They invited the International Commission of Jurists to send an investigating mission to review the documents and the case. It was a limited mandate. And I recall that they came in April of that year, and they conducted, looked at the evidence. They weren't able to see all of the evidence because the police files mysteriously could not be found while they were present in Georgetown. The police files subsequently turned up after they left. We gave evidence to this commission, and we suggested other people whom we felt could be of assistance to them. So they, in fact, left after and made a short report. And in the report, they made a number of recommendations. One, they said that Donald Rodney's trial, his appeal against conviction, should really be completed because justice delayed is justice denied, and the appeal court should hear Rodney's thing and be finished with that. The second was that the inquest was, to use the language of the jurists, marred by grave defects. What they said, it was rubbish, we had to throw it away. And thirdly, there were clearly grounds for a full-fledged commission of inquiry with powers. And it later emerged that the ICJ, the International Commission of Jurists, were themselves prepared to be the body mounting the full investigation. Very soon after that, the cabinet established a subcommittee that was going to do preparatory work for this full commission. And that essentially was the last that was heard of the idea of a full commission. We heard nothing else. A year later, again under mounting pressure from us, by this time we are really quite appalled at the pace of things. Gregory Smith was still in position. And we were saying, look, at the very least, we have to charge Gregory Smith with murder and bring him before the courts. Prepare your commission, take your time, that's good. Yeah. But we know where the murderer is. And he should come and face the courts of Guyana and let him say what he has to say.
And of course he's in French Guyana.
As we speak,
yeah,
he's in French Guyana. So we finally got them to charge him. On June 13th, I think it was, what, two years ago?
Yes, 1996.
2 years ago, we got them to go to the courts. We went to the courts in front of Magistrate Juman Yassin and Dudnath Singh, who had been our lawyer all through the arson trial and the treason trials, and a very close friend of Walter's. We went there, and they actually charged Gregory Smith with murder and issued an arrest warrant. Well, this was quite a development, because apart from Guyana's action, nothing had happened. So the question now became the question of approaching the French. We have no extradition treaty with France, so it had to be done diplomatically. A number of hurdles were immediately thrown up, that the French, under European law, would not be allowed to extradite a person to a country that had the death penalty. Although our lawyers subsequently found out that there was precedent. If the highest authorities in Guyana were to give a guarantee to the French that were he to be convicted of murder, he would not be executed, then they would be able to send him. So they asked for all the documents, all the evidence, the statements from the witnesses. Those were prepared. It took a very long time, but they were prepared finally, and they were sent. And the latest thing is that they are now asking that they be translated into French. So the business of translating these documents into French, I don't know how far that has reached. When I spoke to the foreign minister, it could not have been more than about 2 or 3 months ago on this matter. He told me they were actively working on that. I subsequently understand that, came to understand that the French have some rule, a 10-year, what do you call it, where the thing expires, where you can no longer act. Well, if nothing had been done for 10 years, then the statute of limitations, there was a statute of limitations, it ran out. And this is where the beauty of Guyana's private action comes in. That private action taken almost eccentrically by Guyana.
As only Guyana can do.
As only he can do. Turns out to have been absolutely crucial. Because of that private action, which constitutes action in the courts, he has not been able to, they have not been able to invoke the 10-year limitation. So the thing is active. I'm hoping that we can solve this diplomatic thing quickly, because Smith is a wanted man. He's now wanted by the police, wanted by the courts, and we want the French to move him. And if he comes to Guyana, we want him to face a trial, and we will guarantee he gets a fair and free trial, a fair trial. And then perhaps parallel to that, or following that, we can have a commission of inquiry if we want to get to the fuller truth and to deal with the intellectual authors of the action. But that is
yes. Let's, and it's interesting that you have updated us on the status of that case, because a lot of people have been asking what is happening to the matter. In fact, the PPP has been charged with dragging its feet. Let's talk about what your party has been doing, the WPA, to keep the memory of Walter Rodney alive.
Well, you know, it's very interesting. I've just come, you yourself were present, from this international Walter Rodney symposium. They had a big gathering on Walter Rodney's legacy at Binghamton. And it was a most inspiring experience, I found, because it gathered up scholars from really all over the world. Some came from Africa, all over the United States, some came from Europe, and came there and essentially put forward the work that they themselves had been doing. And there were many Rodneyists among them, you know, people like Horace Campbell and Winston James, and people I personally hadn't seen Winston James since the days of the 1980s when we were...
George Lamming was there.
George Lamming was there, gave a most inspiring address. And it just said to me, you know, that here we were at the end of the century, approaching the new millennium. When we look at Africa, and when we look at the part of the world that really engaged Walter Rodney, and the challenges that this world faces, challenges in relation to, you know, the WTO and trade arrangements and globalization and the agonies of IMF conditionalities and where we have gone. And you see that these ideas of Walter Rodney are more appropriate than ever, that the tradition is so rich, and that people are again turning to him for an explanation of this condition in which we find ourselves. And I believe recently there was quite an important gathering in Africa, where a lot of African leaders were getting together, and people were saying, well, Walter Rodney wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa in the 1970s. It's now 20 years after that. Where has Africa gone?
Yes,
Where
yes.
has Africa gone? What has happened to development? And so on. So a lot of the questions that he had posed and the analyses he had made and so on are clearly alive and well and need revisiting. In Guyana, what we have been attempting to do through our political work, of course, is to keep up the work of education, to keep up the work of documentation, because part of Rodney's tremendous contribution as a historian was to really attempt to tell the history of the voiceless, the history of the repressed, to recuperate the history of the working people, which official historiography had done its best to either ignore or to suppress. And he was able to excavate a lot of that history.
And his last book, The History of the Guyanese Working People,
so
1881 to 1905,
very good example of that method.
All over. I mean, at the conference, I mean, women, feminists were talking about how we treated the gender issue in that, and that's a development in terms of widening the breadth of Rodney's work. You in Guyana, your party has been talking recently about setting up a Walter Rodney Institute.
We have set up a Walter Rodney Institute. In fact, we launched the institute at Binghamton.
Right.
And this institute is going to be able, in the first place, to really draw in, create this global network of Rodneyists and activists out there, many of whom are located in institutions, in academies, in governments, and to try to draw them and have the institute be a kind of hub where we'll be able to create this network. And what is the institute going to do? What we're going to do is really carry on with the work that Walter began, the work of documentation. Brother Guyana, for instance, has just completed an absolutely fascinating history of Buxton, which I can't wait to
Buxton is my home village, of course.
Right. And I'm hoping that perhaps that is the kind of work that we can do out of the Institute. You know, many, many years ago, when we weren't quite sure what he was talking about, Guyana talked about the setting up of a Department of Culture. And what he really meant was a department that would concentrate precisely on this, oral histories, trying to really write about and document the people's traditions, you know, so that we don't run away with the belief that the history is the work of rulers, but that history was the work of the ordinary people, and to try to record that history, document it. So the Institute will be doing a lot of that work. We'll also be doing sort of training in empowerment, what we think of as empowerment activity. To give you a very concrete example, we have many, many Amerindian village councils in Guyana. 80-odd village councils, elected periodically. They elect a captain and they have councillors. What we would like to do is to begin to assist them in relation to managing affairs, to bring them up to date on modern techniques of management, running the villages, getting into development plans for the village. How do you carry out work of this kind? So I see the Institute as getting into what I regard as people's empowerment studies, because, as you know, a central pillar of Rodney's thought was self-emancipation, that people have to really acquire the mastery over their lives, and the way you do this is really to get people equipped to emancipate themselves. And so we want to carry on with that work. We're going to be running a television studio out of the Institute to concentrate on education and culture, because I don't know if you know where education has reached in Guyana.
We've talked about it in this program several times before.
I mean, a recent survey, it's the most chilling thing, but in a recent survey, I think at about 2 years old, a study commissioned and done by the University of Guyana and accepted by the ministry, so they're not attempting to deny it, showed that Guyanese school leavers, people out of school between the age of 60 and 24, that there was an 89% functional illiteracy rate. I mean, you know, what is that? In a country that once boasted virtually 100% literacy.
You're talking about 9 out of 10.
9 out of 10 people who cannot read and write and count. Yeah. So the challenge there is immense. And this brings you to one of the paradoxes of, say, the last election. I had really figured that, look, we have an immensely young electorate. It's quite possible that these young people will not walk in the ways of their fathers and mothers and will break out of the pattern of racial voting and voting out of insecurity and so on. It didn't happen. Part of the reason it didn't happen was, of course, that when you look at the explanation, well, I mean, these are people who can barely read and write.
We're going to take a break here, Dr. Roopnarine, and when we come back, we will take up the issue of the last elections in Guyana and hear what is the WPA position as we deal with the aftermath of those elections. Don't go anywhere. CaribNation, we'll be right back. Welcome back to CaribNation. Dr. Roopnarine.